I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close-Up. President Donald Trump delivered his much-delayed State of the Union address this past Tuesday. We'll have a post-mortem to try to make some sense of it all. Later on, I'll have some additional thoughts on CODA. But we begin with an issue that never goes away, race relations in America. Virginia's government is in turmoil over who wore blackface when, but the issue is about a lot more than appearances. Joining us to discuss its implications, Eleanor Randolph, New York Times contributing writer, and Mara Gay, a member of the New York Times editorial board. We're talking before the weekend, so anything can happen, of course, but in Virginia, they seem to be getting down to a school custodian who may be running the government by the time they're through eliminating people who haven't done something wrong. It's very interesting. There was a fascinating quote from the governor that I think Wesley Morris of the Times quoted. The governor said, "In the place and time where I grew up, many actions that we rightfully recognize as abhorrent today were commonplace." Does that make them excusable, or under what circumstances are they? Or when does the statute of limitations on them lapse? Or, how do we apply today's standards to something that people did back in 1984, or when they were in high school, or what?
So I would say that there's actually nothing that's ever been excusable about blackface. It was used first starting in the late 1800s to mock and mimic African Americans then. It was used perniciously at the time and ever since. Now, that said, I think the larger question is, everyone in America, this country has a shared history of racial trauma, and it's something that we still are struggling to overcome. So people make mistakes. It doesn't entitle you to a second chance, especially as a public official, but people do make mistakes. So the bigger question that I have is, how do you ask for forgiveness? How do you take responsibility? How do you provide moral leadership if you're still in a position to do so? And I actually think that we saw two separate approaches to that. One from Governor Northam and another from Attorney General Mark Herring, who actually said in a, I thought, really remarkable statement yesterday that he actually took responsibility in a way that we hadn't seen before. He said it was the most painful, shameful moment of his life wearing blackface. And he said he'd tried to make up for that racial injustice ever since. And he also said that he knew it was wrong at the time.
And the governor really, I hate to say was stupid, but how can you say, first of all, well, that's not me in the picture, or maybe it is? It was almost like a Jackie Mason routine. And then, to talk about, as Wesley Morris pointed out, the real sin of this was trying to take the shoe polish off rather than the sin of going in blackface. Eleanor?
Well, as a Southerner and a person who grew up in the South, I can tell you that by 1984, everybody knew that this was wrong.
Everybody knew better.
Everybody knew better. The 60s brought out, we had Martin Luther King and going through the 60s and all that trauma. And of course, fraternities did crazy things. We saw that with Brett Kavanaugh, and so what was interesting to me, as Mara said, is that at least these Democrats are coming out and saying, I did it, and I was wrong, and I apologize. You never got that from Brett Kavanaugh. And he's sitting on the Supreme Court for life. And of course, you don't get that from Donald Trump. They're just, they don't have to say, I'm sorry, apparently, if you're a Republican.
At what point do you say you're sorry, take responsibility, and move on? At what point do you take responsibility and quit?
I actually think that that's a question that should be up to the voters in a sense. Not that there should be a referendum officially, but I think that the response of Governor Northam has been less than stellar, to say the least. And I don't think he's taken full responsibility. But I think that when you see someone like Mark Herring actually take real responsibility, you can actually start to have conversations about where to go from here. And it's interesting that Herring chose to tell the Legislative Black Caucus first. and have that private conversation. I mean, everything that he has done is, I think, PR 101 case study in exactly how you handle it, but also the right thing to do.
And also, if I'm not mistaken, he came out and said it before he was caught,
Right.
whereas the governor was outed, if you will, by a conservative website. You also wonder, where was the opposition research when he was running? But on the other hand, Jamel Bouie in the Times pointed out that it took House Republicans 16 years to say anything about Steve King, who was making racist statements as a congressman, until he said something more outrageous in an interview with the New York Times. So how do we equate someone who appeared in blackface, in 1984 as a adolescent, if you will, versus a sitting congressman who was saying racist things? Are we talking about appearances versus substance? And at the same time, we allow things going on like voter suppression and substantive things in this country, maybe not accept outright discrimination and prejudicial statements like we used to, racial obscenities like we used to, but things go on that really shouldn't be acceptable anymore.
Well, how about the white supremacist in the White House?
Well, the white supremacist in the White House, who we know this is a cheap shot, but I'll say it anyway, at the National Prayer Breakfast the other day, talked about since the founding of our nation, many of our greatest strides from gaining independence to abolition of civil rights. Okay, that was a slip of the tongue, but as you say, it was a little too glib. Yeah. Well, okay, but what about that? How did the Republicans, on the one hand, denounce the governor of Virginia for this and allow Stephen King to be part of their caucus?
I mean,
it's
a great
almost
question.
a rhetorical question.
Well, right, absolutely. Look, I don't think that the history of racism in the country is a partisan issue. It's an American issue. So it's not a problem of the Democrats or the liberals or the conservatives or the Republicans. Everybody has skeletons in their closet on this issue. It's a shared history. It's something we all need to have a real conversation about, I believe, and confront honestly and with intellectual honesty. And of course, we're not seeing that from the Republicans. To Eleanor's point, we are seeing some of that intellectual honesty, I think, from the Democrats. It's consistent.
Well, one of the things to go back, Nixon really brought the South into the Republican Party. His Southern strategy was, frankly, racist.
And it worked.
And it worked. And so that's a long time ago. That's been part of the Republican Party for quite some time. It's not like Donald Trump is this incredible aberration. That it's been there. It's been sort of boiling under the surface, and then it comes out with Congressman Smith. But I think, I think if you look at the Southern strategy, you will see that kind of racism.
On the other hand, we did elect Barack Obama as the president, which I think
not from the South.
No, but that's true. But he was elected, and when you look at Stacey Abrams, we've come a long way from Shirley Chisholm. So I guess there are some reasons to be hopeful.
There's plenty of reasons to be hopeful. I don't think that it's a history we can't overcome or haven't overcome in certain moments, Barack Obama's election being one of them. But it's something that we still grapple with, and I think the reason is because we are so reluctant to have conversations about it. We don't know how to talk about race. We only know not to.
Why?
Well, because it's uncomfortable. And I think it would require also taking responsibility.
Is that because whites feel guilty about it, and blacks don't often feel that comfortable talking about it either, do they?
Well, I think it's, when you think about the trauma that the country has been through, Black Americans, but also others, because of the history of slavery and Jim Crow and racism, there is a lot of personal trauma, and there's also a lot of dishonesty about what that history is. I don't think we really learn how the graphic nature of what really took place. And And I think putting things back in the historical context can help us have those conversations.
Well, you do have like that new museum in Alabama. You do, people are starting to
Which
actually.
would be required to visit, I think.
That's right. That and the Holocaust Museum should be required for every high school student, because you are starting to look the horrors of lynching in look at it straight instead of. I mean, that's what makes this blackface, and the Ku Klux Klan guy standing next to him. That's what makes it so horrible, I think.
Right. I mean, you're making light of terrorism, of a period of terrorism in American history that has never been fully accounted for or talked about or confronted.
And that really wasn't all that long ago. We'll
Not at
be
all.
back in a moment to talk about the State of the Union right after this. I'm Sam Roberts of the Times, and welcome back to the New York Times Close-Up. We're with Eleanor Randolph and Mara Gay to talk about the President's State of the Union speech. Let's take a look at something he said the other night.
There is a new opportunity in American politics if only we have the courage together to seize it.
One of the things he did not do was say that things had really changed. He did not admit that the midterms were a moment of defeat for him. He did not offer a real olive branch to the Democrats. He talked about women and the fact that there are more women in Congress, but he didn't point out that that was the result of the reaction to him.
Well, he did the opposite of that, really. He said that, there's no way we're going to make any progress in this country if we have investigations. He was aiming straight at the Democrats when he said that, because they're doing things like, really outrageous things like trying to get his tax returns and, and following up on investigations that the Republicans had stopped. So, he was really, that was a warning shot, I thought. And not only did he not really give the Democrats credit for having that incredible feel, if you looked at that audience, you had this sort of white, mostly male panorama on the Republican side, and then just as diverse as America on the other side.
And the women dressed in white.
Yes, well, that's right.
You'd think he would have done something. I know it would have been a very dramatic gesture and a lot to ask, but to have said, okay, I won't build the wall, or I won't do something, or I'll make some sort of concession, but there seemed to be nothing like that at all.
No, I think this is on brand for him. He is about the base. That's who brought him to this party, I think, the way he sees it, and he's going to dance with them all the way.
But he still needs 10 or 15 or whatever % more than that base. Does that mean the Democrats have to screw up, or he has to do something to go beyond that?
I personally do think that his chances of re-election are not awesome because of that. I think it's very difficult for him. He's not interested in persuasion. And we saw that the other night. He's just interested in doubling down and offering red meat to his base.
I think there was another warning shot that night, and that was he sort of said that America would never be a socialist nation. Mm-hmm. And so, okay, he's going after Bernie, but really there are a lot of people who think that he was setting up his campaign message and coming after the Democrats because they want health care and, unions and things like that. And he's going to use the term socialism to scare people, because that's what he does. He's a fearmonger, and that's going to be the next thing that people are supposed to be afraid of.
And he did that on abortion as well, and totally misstated the new New York law. Is that right?
Oh, entirely misstated the Virginia legislation, but in New York misstated the law entirely, and was extremely graphic about it, which was, I thought, really crude. But all the New York law does is codify Roe v. Wade in state law so that women have an opportunity to get an abortion after 24 weeks in the event that their health is at stake, or if there are severe fetal abnormalities. And that's a matter of health, and it's between a woman and her doctor. And the co-opting of that for his agenda, I mean, the misinformation is really anti-woman.
The health of the child was, I think, the only thing new in that law, and that was it.
Well, it did a couple other small things, none of which Donald Trump talked about.
And there was virtually nothing new in the speech except this statement about North Korea.
Much work remains to be done, but my relationship with Kim Jong-un is a good one. Chairman Kim and I will meet again on February 27th and 28th in Vietnam.
Later in the week, the president said that if people upstate don't like things in New York, they should just move out and go to another state. Meanwhile, the state and the city both getting less revenue than expected. What does that mean? Are we experiencing a little blip in the economy, or is this the sign of something worse?
Well, so far we have some fluctuations in the stock market, which can affect New York City especially, and New York State more than elsewhere, just because Wall Street is here at home. So that's where we are so far. But there are plenty of people who, even for the past 2 years, have been concerned of a slowdown. We are in, I think, the 16th or 17th, no, forgive me, not that long, maybe the 8th year of a turnaround. So, it's inevitable at some point.
But the other thing is that the tax plan that Donald Trump, pushed through Congress really punishes New York and New Jersey and a number of other states by limiting the amount you can write off in your mortgage taxes. And so that we don't know, we don't have the details yet, but it wouldn't surprise me if people have moved as a result of that.
Well, the governor says people are moving to places like Florida and lower tax states. No evidence really of that so far. Do people really get up and move for that reason?
I don't know.
I'm not an economist, so I don't know.
And I don't make enough to be able to do it, or need to.
I think a lot of us feel like we're not leaving New York anytime soon.
No, not for that reason. Albany seems to be moving a lot faster than Congress on legislation now that the Democrats are controlling the Senate. They've passed a lot. What more is on their agenda that we're going to see coming up?
We're going to see bail reform, criminal justice reform, congestion pricing, which is going to be a pretty heavy lift. It's important to fund fixes to the subway and the rest of the MTA.
Now, the governor did something the end of the week that I found sort of fascinating. He said there's going to be a 30% fare hike unless the legislature passes congestion pricing. This is the same governor who said to the MTA, don't raise the fare at all because, you don't have, you're overspending, you don't need the money. But I can't stop you because I don't control the MTA.
Well,
so now he's saying he's going to raise the fare 30%.
Yeah, but that's just in many ways, a negotiating position on congestion pricing.
Right.
He's got to convince the people from the outer boroughs who drive cars into Manhattan that they're going to come up with a plan to help the MTA so they don't have to raise prices 30%. And they also are going to have to increase the buses in places like Outer Queens and other places like that to make it acceptable, to make congestion pricing acceptable to the outer boroughs.
And also to Long Island lawmakers and Westchester lawmakers who
Right.
are going to be, I think, kind of impediments, frankly, to getting
Resistant.
congestion. Yes, to getting
Well, what do we
congestion
think? I mean, this is supposedly the year to get it done. It's an off year for state elections. It's not quite now or never, but is this the year?
This is the year to get it done. I do have faith that with everyone pushing for it, including the editorial boards, that we can
Well,
make
then
it
it's
happen.
bound to happen.
That's right. Tune in. But in all seriousness, it has to happen. And the goal of the governor, I think, should be to convince, along with the legislative leaders, to convince upstate New Yorkers and suburbanites and suburban lawmakers that this is also in their interest. And you can do that by increasing service and increasing payroll taxes or gas taxes to help get upgrades in the suburbs on commuter rails. But you can also do it by reminding them that the state revenues that they enjoy are going to dry up if the subway system is allowed to die, because the subway system fuels New York City and the entire region. And without the city tax revenues, the rest of the state's dead in the water.
Dick Ravitch did such a good job of selling that message back in the 1980s. Is anyone doing the same thing now?
No.
Where is Dick Ravitch when we really need him? Yeah, no, I mean, I wish it weren't called congestion
I know.
pricing.
Can't we come up with a new name?
I know.
I'll take ideas.
Take the pricing out of it. Even the congestion
I know, it
sounds
sounds
like
like
something you
sinus.
want to cure.
That's right. That's right. But, but Mara's right. If you don't do something about, Wall Street and central Manhattan, things are going to start, we're going to start having real trouble. And, the subway, how many times do we sit in the subway station just waiting and waiting and waiting, and you can barely understand what the person is saying on the, microphone. And so, something, every time anybody, should be some way that every time somebody complains about the MTA, we should sort of hold up a sign that says congestion pricing will help.
Or have a contest to come up with a new name.
I'm for that.
Okay, that sounds good. Two more quick questions. Ethics legislation, any chance of anything happening on that in this session?
No, I actually do think that there's a chance of getting some ethics reform. They did close the LLC loophole, which is a good start. It's not directly in ethics, campaign finance, but we should replace J-Cope. There's a lot of things that we can do to make Albany work better.
Okay, and one more question. The agreement between the Housing Authority and the feds sounded to me like a pretty lousy deal. They take control and we get nothing in return, no money at all from the feds. Is that right?
That's essentially right. I mean, we wrote about this. I think that the federal government bears much of the responsibility for the state of public housing across the country and in New York, and for them to come in and give us a monitor with no funding is a raw deal.
Thanks to Eleanor Randolph and Mara Gay, and I'll add my thoughts on CODA coming up next. The obituary I wrote in the Times this week of James McManus, the West Side Democratic District leader, prompted this letter from Ashley Wright of Princeton. This obit, he wrote, strikes a deep chord. My mother, born in Hell's Kitchen in 1906 to immigrant parents, arose from the squalor there when the neighborhood was earning its name. She went on to Hunter High School, Smith College, and Columbia University for a PhD in economics, all possible because she and her three siblings worked tirelessly for Tammany Hall to get the poor vote out when called upon to do so. Her younger sister followed in her footsteps. Her two brothers received appointments to the Naval Academy. Again, Ashley Wright wrote, because of the family's dedication to the democratic machine of the day. Favors for favors. Jimmy McManus had used the same word, favors, in defining how his family's dynasty had survived since 1892. I'm still collecting on favors that were done 20 years ago by my father and 50 years ago by my great uncles, he told me. That's what organization politics is all about. McManus was the last of the long-reigning district leaders of Tammany Hall. Its reputation was for plunder and patronage, but it was also about the right to vote and what Pat Moynihan called the possibilities of politics. In 1905, McManus's great-uncle deposed George Washington Plunkett, who coined the phrase honest graft and professed, I seen my opportunities and I took them. Back then, a district leader could find a loyal constituent a job, a meal, or a key to getting out of jail. But by the time Jim McManus inherited the job in 1963, the feral Tammany tiger had been domesticated. McManus survived, though. He fended off gangsters. Once, he told me, they brought an old man into the club who needed a place to live. I said, "What was your profession?" He said, "Pickpocket, but I never robbed a guy, a working guy. I can't work anymore because my eyes are going." McManus got the guy an apartment. While some party reformers were defending the civil liberties of prostitutes in Times Square during the mid-1970s, McManus was more concerned with his constituents. The trouble is that some of these reform politicians think they have a right to vote their conscience, he said. In this neighborhood, we think that when you're elected, you have to vote the way the people want you to vote. Another reader, Mary Cummings, wrote me a fitting coda to McManus's career. "It's always a joy to read about the colorful line of New York political operatives with no instinct for hypocrisy," she said, "upsetting the hypocrites and having such a good time doing it." For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.